One of the most quietly destructive things I see in people is the way they build an entire life inside their heads. It's a place that feels safe, predictable, and rewarding because it's a world where things finally make sense. In that world, you're confident, you say the right words, people respect you, you achieve the goals that feel impossible in real life. And because your brain can give you that little taste of satisfaction through imagination, it starts returning there again and again. That's the fantasy trap. It doesn't begin as an illness or a moral failure. It usually begins as an act of self-preservation. When you're young and reality feels harsh or uncontrollable, fantasy becomes a form of medicine. Maybe you were lonely and the people around you didn't notice. Maybe you had dreams that nobody encouraged. So your mind started compensating. It created stories where you were finally understood, where the effort paid off, where someone saw you. And in the moment that you enter that world, your nervous system relaxes. The fantasy offers emotional regulation that reality refused to provide. Over time, the brain learns something dangerous, that you can feel good without doing anything real. It learns that a thought, an image, a scenario in your head can temporarily replace the work, the vulnerability, the slow progress of real life. So whenever life gets hard, your brain chooses the shortcut. It drifts away, opens that private movie theater, and plays the version of you who already made it. That's why people stuck in the fantasy trap often describe this weird double existence. Outwardly, they might look passive, unmotivated, or even lazy. But inside their head, they're constantly moving, talking, fixing, creating. The problem is that none of it leaves the mind. Nothing crosses the bridge into the world where consequences and rewards actually exist. If you ask someone who lives in fantasy what they really want, they can describe it in astonishing detail. They know the car, the house, the partner, the version of themselves that finally feels free. But if you ask them what they're doing today to build that reality, the answer collapses into silence. It is not that they don't care. It is that the fantasy has hijacked the part of the brain that is supposed to tolerate discomfort. The dopamine from daydreaming replaces the slow burn of real discipline. When I talk to people caught in this pattern, I never tell them to stop dreaming. That doesn't work, because fantasy isn't the enemy, it's a signal. It's your mind trying to show you what kind of emotional nourishment you're missing. If you imagine success all the time, maybe it's because in real life you feel powerless. If you imagine love or intimacy, maybe you're starved for connection. The content of your fantasy reveals the wound that you're avoiding. That's the door back to reality. The trap deepens when you start judging yourself for escaping. Now you have two layers of suffering, one from unmet needs and one from guilt. You tell yourself you're lazy, weak, addicted to imagination. You try to suppress it, but that only drives the craving deeper underground. The right move isn't to crush fantasy, it's to listen to it. Ask why it feels better than the present moment. Ask what emotional truth it's offering that the real world is not. Because until you meet that need in reality, your brain will keep returning to the illusion. There's also a social dimension here. We live in a culture that rewards fantasy. Social media, games, movies, even advertising all feed the same circuitry. They invite you into simulated achievement, simulated relationships, simulated progress. The more time you spend there, the harder it becomes to find satisfaction in real-world effort. You get a cheap reward for zero risk. Over time, your tolerance for real uncertainty drops. You start chasing comfort instead of growth. The fantasy promises everything, but it quietly drains the energy you need to make any of it real. What's tragic is that people in the fantasy trap often have extraordinary potential. The creativity required to build such detailed inner worlds is the same creativity that could solve problems, invent, design, heal. But it's trapped behind fear that if they try for real and fail, they'll lose the only place where things go right. So they protect the fantasy like a sacred space. They defend it from reality, even though that defense guarantees that none of it will ever happen. I think that's one of the hardest conversations to have with yourself. To admit that the thing that comforts you is also the thing that is quietly killing your momentum. To admit that the beautiful vision in your mind is not a prophecy, but a coping mechanism, that's painful. But it's also the beginning of freedom, because once you name the illusion, you can begin to use it intentionally. You can translate parts of it into reality instead of hiding inside it. When people start to wake up from fantasy, the first stage often feels like grief. You realize how many years you've spent imagining instead of doing. You look back at all the energy you invested in mental simulations that never left your head. That sadness is real. But it's also necessary. You can reclaim your life without mourning the time you lost to the dream version of it. The trick is to let that sadness motivate you instead of paralyze you. Every minute you wake up from the fantasy is a minute you can invest in reality. Sometimes people ask how to know if a dream is a fantasy or a goal. The difference isn't in the content. It's in the behavior it produces. A fantasy gives you comfort. A goal makes you uncomfortable. A fantasy makes you feel good right now. A goal demands effort that only feels good later. If your vision of the future doesn't require any present moment sacrifice, it's probably fantasy. That doesn't mean it's bad. It just means it's incomplete. You need to ground it. Grounding doesn't mean giving up imagination. It means attaching imagination to small, tangible actions. If you dream of being fit, the fantasy is the picture in your head of a toned body. The grounding is 5 minutes of exercise. If you dream of being an artist, the fantasy is the gallery show. The grounding is one sketch today. If you dream of love, the fantasy is the perfect relationship. The grounding is one vulnerable conversation. The moment you link your fantasy to a physical behavior, you reclaim the power it stole from you. There's another layer that people rarely talk about. Some fantasies are not about achieving something, but about escaping something. These are the ones that appear after trauma or chronic stress. You start imagining alternate realities because the current one feels intolerable. That's why when you try to take away the fantasy, you feel panic. It's not just daydreaming, it's a survival mechanism. Your nervous system is saying, if I face reality without this escape, I might break. That's why healing isn't about destroying the fantasy, but about making reality safe enough that you don't need it. When your nervous system feels secure, the fantasy loses its addictive power. A lot of the time, this process begins in very small steps. Instead of disappearing into imagination for hours, you start by noticing when it happens. You name it. My brain is retreating because something feels too hard. That moment of awareness interrupts the automatic pattern. Then you ask, what is my mind protecting me from right now? Maybe it's the discomfort of rejection, the boredom of work, the fear of failure. Each answer gives you a clue about the emotional skill you need to develop. Over months, this awareness rebuilds your ability to stay in reality even when it's painful. Another thing that helps is sharing the fantasy with someone safe. When you describe it out loud, it starts to lose its magical secrecy. You begin to see how it functions. Often, people realize their fantasies are actually blueprints for unmet parts of themselves. A person who constantly imagines saving others might secretly crave to feel needed. A person who imagines being adored might just want to feel seen. A person who imagines perfect control might be terrified of chaos. Once you identify that core need, you can meet it directly instead of through imagination. As this process unfolds, you start to notice something subtle. Reality, though slower and more difficult, begins to feel richer. The small real moments, finishing a task, having an honest talk, feeling your body move, start to carry emotional weight that fantasy never delivered. That's how you know the trap is loosening. You're learning to get dopamine from truth instead of illusion. And that's one of the deepest forms of healing. I don't think we should demonize fantasy. The human mind is wired to imagine, to simulate, to project into the future. That's how we invent, create, fall in love. The problem arises when we use that power to avoid rather than to build. Fantasy should be a tool, not a shelter. It should guide your steps, not replace them. The goal isn't to stop dreaming. It has to wake up enough that your dreams can finally step out of your head and start living alongside you. And that's where the real work begins, transforming the energy of imagination into the courage of action. The real challenge of escaping the fantasy trap isn't just taking action. It's tolerating how disappointing reality can feel compared to your imagination. When you first step out of your mind and try to build something real, it feels dull, frustrating, sometimes humiliating. You go to the gym once and your body still looks the same. You start writing and it's clumsy. You talk to someone new and the conversation is awkward. Reality moves at a painfully slow pace compared to the instant gratification your mind is used to. And that's where most people relapse. The fantasy feels easier because it gives you instant relief, while reality makes you feel incompetent again. The work here isn't about discipline. It's about emotional tolerance, learning to stay present with the discomfort of being imperfect. The first few months of trying to build real momentum often feel like walking through fog. You know what direction you're going, but you can't see more than a few feet ahead. And your brain, addicted to certainty, panics. It starts whispering, "You're wasting time. You could just go back to imagining success instead of failing in real life." But if you can survive that whisper, if you can stay with the uncertainty, something subtle begins to shift. The dopamine that used to come from fantasy starts to come from progress, no matter how small. You begin to find a strange kind of pride, not in being perfect, but in showing up. That's when you start to grow up psychologically, when doing becomes more rewarding than dreaming. For a lot of people, breaking free from fantasy also means grieving the self they imagined they'd be by now. The fantasy version of you was flawless. That version had all the answers, all the confidence, all the success. Letting go of that person feels like killing a part of yourself. But what you're really doing is letting that illusion die so something more authentic can live. It's like mourning a ghost. Once you accept that you'll never become that idealized version, you can finally start becoming someone real. This is why self-compassion matters so much in this process. Without it, you'll hate yourself every time you notice how far you are from the fantasy. You'll look at reality and feel like you're failing before you even begin. Compassion is the bridge that keeps you from collapsing back into imagination. It says, yes, I'm far from where I want to be, but that's okay. At least I'm here. It replaces perfection with presence, because healing from fantasy isn't about speed. It's about honesty. It's about learning to tell yourself the truth even when the truth hurts. Over time, something interesting happens when you stop feeding your brain constant fantasy dopamine. Your imagination doesn't die, it matures. It becomes more strategic, more connected to reality. You start daydreaming not as an escape, but as a rehearsal. Instead of imagining success to feel good, you start visualizing steps to make it happen. That's the healthy use of imagination. It's your brain practicing for the real world. The same tool that once trapped you becomes the one that guides you. The transformation looks different for everyone. Some people notice they have more energy because they're no longer burning it on mental movies. Some notice they feel more alive, even when things are hard. Others feel a kind of quiet sadness at first, because fantasy used to fill their emptiness. But even that sadness is a sign of progress. It means you finally feeling what is real instead of covering it up. The more you let yourself experience that raw truth, the stronger your emotional muscles become. And over time, you start to prefer reality, even with all its flaws. There's a moment I've seen happen in people who truly wake up from fantasy. It's not loud or dramatic. It's quiet. They'll tell me, I don't need things to be perfect anymore. I just want them to be real. That's the point when the brain stops chasing illusion and starts trusting life again. Because real life, with all its uncertainty, failure, awkwardness, and imperfection, is the only place where growth happens. Fantasy can give you pleasure, but it can't give you transformation. If you really think about it, every fantasy contains a seed of truth. You wouldn't dream of being loved if you didn't know love was possible. You wouldn't imagine success if you didn't have potential. You wouldn't create a world where you matter unless some part of you already does. The fantasy shows you what's inside you, even if it disguises it as something external. The work is to extract that truth and nurture it in the soil of real experience. When you do that, you're no longer running from reality, you're partnering with it. Sometimes people worry that letting go of fantasy will make life boring, but the opposite happens. Once your emotional energy isn't trapped in pretending, you start noticing how vivid the world really is. Food tastes better, music hits deeper, conversations mean more. Even pain becomes meaningful because it's real. Fantasy dulls both the highs and the lows. Reality, when fully lived, makes both profound. That's what most people actually crave, not constant pleasure, but genuine aliveness. It's also worth mentioning that the fantasy trap often reappears in new disguises. Once you stop daydreaming about fame or love, you might start fantasizing about healing itself. You might imagine the perfect mental health version of you who meditates daily, journals perfectly, eats clean, and never gets triggered. That too becomes a fantasy, a spiritual one. The mind is clever. It can turn anything into illusion. So the goal is not to build a new fantasy of who you'll be after healing, but to keep returning to the present moment where healing actually happens. Reality is always here. It's the only place that doesn't need to be imagined. If you're listening to this and recognizing yourself, I want you to know this isn't a reason for shame. It's proof that your mind is trying to protect you the only way it knows how. The fantasy wasn't a mistake, it was a bridge. It carried you over a painful landscape when you didn't yet have the tools to walk it. Now that you do, you can thank it and let it go. You can say, I don't need to live there anymore. I'm strong enough to live here, and every time you do that, every time you choose reality over illusion, you reclaim another piece of your life. The truth is, fantasy never really disappears. It just changes form. You'll still have visions, hopes, and stories in your head, but now you'll use them differently. Instead of hiding inside them, you'll invite them to walk beside you. You'll say, okay, dream, show me where to go next, but I'll take the steps myself. And slowly, the gap between what you imagine and what you live will begin to shrink. That's when you realize the fantasy was never about escaping reality. It was your soul's way of reminding you what you were meant to create in it.